Welcome, everyone, of all ages, to the first in the Thomas Jefferson Center's lecture series for this school year. The Thomas Jefferson Center, of which I'm the co-director, Lorraine Pangle, has not only a lecture series, but an undergraduate book club. Next week, we will be discussing some of the writings of Thomas Jefferson, a postdoctoral fellows program, an undergraduate Jefferson Scholars program for honors students, a study abroad summer program in Rome, and our central project is the certificate program in core texts and ideas, which is an integrated six-course sequence of courses in the great books that will introduce you to the great ideas and controversies that have shaped Western civilization and the world that we live in. Today, I'm very pleased to have with us Professor John Rumrich, who is the A.J. and W.D. Thaman Professor of English here at UT. Professor Rumrich teaches the works of John Milton, 17th century British poetry, and Shakespeare's plays, all informed by their political, religious, and literary contexts. He's been an NEH Fellow, an editor of Texas Studies in Literature and Language, and a visiting professor in France, Ireland, South Africa, and China, much to the envy of some of his colleagues. In his book, Milton Unbound, Professor Rumrich has taken on the orthodoxies of Milton scholarship and criticism, and has challenged the reigning view of Milton as a dogmatic and censorious preacher and misogynist, arguing instead for a far more complex Milton open to doubt and uncertainty. More recently, he co-edited the volume Milton and Heresy, which collects essays by leading scholars documenting some of Milton's unorthodox beliefs and doubts. He's written dozens of articles and book chapters on Milton and Shakespeare, and now he's at work on 2 updated paperbacks for the Modern Library on Milton's minor poetry and on his selected prose. And last but not least, Professor Rumrich is a dedicated coach of Little League Baseball. Today, Professor Rumrich will be speaking to us on Milton's Satanic verses. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Rumrich.
Thank you. I pursued graduate study. I'm sorry, I got to unmute the mic. I pursued graduate study at the University of Virginia in the academical village Thomas Jefferson designed and in 1819 founded. It's a pleasure for me to give a talk for the organization at this academical metropolis that bears his name. Thank you, Thomas and Lorraine Pangle, for leading the Jefferson Center and for inviting me here. Before beginning, I also want to note that some of what I will say today, I've said before more or less in books and articles. I won't cite them in this talk. But those books and articles also include in them references to works by others to whom I was and remain indebted. The purpose of this talk is to introduce the interested students who may be among you to John Milton as I have come to understand him. I hope to also to show that he inspired the men who in the late 18th century invented the United States. The first thing I recall being taught at what people in Charlottesville still call Mr. Jefferson's University is that in presenting an argument, the stronger your straw man, the more memorable and effective the argument will seem that defeats the straw man. To persuade an audience, one should, in other words, square off against what Stephen Colbert calls a formidable opponent. My argument this afternoon is that Milton is not the tiresome Puritan windbag that some of you may suppose him to be, but possibly the most compelling and historically significant writer in the English-speaking world. So you will see from what I am about to show you that I took my early lesson about the choice of straw man to heart.
Okay. Don't write this down, but I find Milton probably as boring as you find Milton. Mrs. Milton found him boring too. He's a little bit long-winded. He doesn't translate very well into our generation, and his jokes are terrible. But that does not relieve you from your responsibility for this material. Now, I'm waiting for reports from some of you. I'm not joking. This is my job.
Now there's a mighty straw man. For one thing, he enjoys the advantage of being a fictional character in a comedy that delights in crudity and excess, and yet, spoiler alert, seems oddly dependent on Paradise Lost for critical plot points. For another, the esteemed professor of English from Faber College, played by the devilishly handsome Donald Sutherland, does a surprisingly effective job of cutting through the fog of critical writing to the heart of Milton's modern reputation. That is, first, Milton's poetry is boring and not funny, and second, he does not translate well into our generation. Good thing Moloch's not here. As for the fictional professor's first point, I have to concede that many readers, especially over the last century, have found Paradise Lost boring and not funny. Milton wrote in an era when the discursive epic, generally thought to have originated with Homer, was considered of all poetic genres the most glorious literary achievement. In classical times, Aristotle judged tragedy the superior genre because of its rigorous structure, unmixed content, and cathartic effect. By the 17th century, however, literary theorists had shifted focus from the nature of the work of art to the achievement of the artist, which is to say that the soaring aspiration that pervades Renaissance culture inspired egocentric revisionism of genre theory. Unlike dramatists, an epic poet shares no glory with actors and acknowledges indebtedness only to a supernatural muse. The grand narrative recounted by an epic poet was mixed and diluted by comparison with drama, moreover, because it was supposed to represent the whole world. To tell the story of everything, an epic poet needs somehow to comprehend everything. And as the tale of Dr. Faustus suggests, Renaissance authors found the heroic pursuit of transcendent knowledge compelling. We have to admit that what Milton accomplished in Paradise Lost is staggering, if only because we come up short of full comprehension despite our best efforts. Even a man as profoundly learned as Samuel Johnson knew this feeling, and in saying so in his Life of Milton, he anticipates Donald Sutherland's fictional professor. We read Milton for instruction, retire harassed and overburdened, and look elsewhere for recreation. We desert our master and seek for companions. For political reasons that I will return to, it was a struggle for Johnson to be fair to Milton. Yet in this case, there is an edge of truth. If you spend enough time trying to wrap your head around Paradise Lost, you will likely reach a point where you realize that you will never get a grip on all that this supremely literate, artistically judicious polyglot knew and could versify so variously. Either that or your head will explode. I do not think that Milton set out to make us feel inferior. But by the time he composed Paradise Lost, the totality of the known world had grown well beyond its Homeric or Virgilian limits. And much of that fresh knowledge swam into view unanticipated, with no more to accompany it in the mind of the unprepared observer than a wild surmise. Born in 1608, Milton lived in the very midst of the great age of European discovery. Poets of his day delighted in rolling out names of the exotic places and behaviors that had been described by intrepid explorers of sea and land, as well as by men of genius, some of whom fostered the stirrings of a scientific revolution, and others who shed revelatory light on past places and peoples through the discovery or rediscovery of classical and scriptural manuscripts. The strange words and names used to speak of all this newness were sure to catch ears, and the job of fitting those strange syllables to blank verse made for a memorable display of poetic craft. Dramatists like Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare exemplify this in evoking some of their grandest characters. The mighty Tamburlaine, for example, asks, "Is it not passing brave to be a king and ride in triumph through Persepolis?" Persepolis is a long way from the south bank of the Thames. Othello admits that he sweet-talked Desdemona with tales of antres vast and deserts idle, and of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagi. Herein lies one explanation, aside from the fact that we no longer find Persepolis or cannibals so unheard of, why modern readers might find Milton boring. Tamburlaine would not exult about riding in triumph through Fort Lauderdale. It's Persepolis that occupies the last 2 feet of that line in a crescendo of blank verse. Othello loves the mere sound of the anthropophagi and spends the time to say all 6 syllables, even though it's no more than a fancy redundancy for the cannibals that each other eat. To a more modern sensibility, and specifically to a modernist aesthetic sensibility, the speeches of these heroes sound orotund and pompous. They value the sound of what they say over the meaning. Meaning conveyed not by connotations and implications of impressive names, but instead by vividly particular visual images prized by the modernist poets. So much depends on a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens, Carlos Williams famously insists, without resort to any words like Persepolis or anthropophagi. The modernist aesthetic preference for refreshing poetic glimpses of more ordinary, unmediated phenomena was in Milton's case preceded by Sir Walter Raleigh's complaint in 1900 that Paradise Lost is a monument to dead ideas. The narrative grip of the Judeo-Christian story of creation had to seem fundamentally weaker after Darwin's Origin of the Species. Even so, we should bear in mind that we should bear in mind as a counterweight that during the voyage of the Beagle, Darwin repeatedly read Paradise Lost at every spare moment, according to report, and came ashore on the Galapagos with Milton's epic under his arm. A lot depends on that image, too, mediated though it may be by its crucial position in the history of ideas. I stress such history because the opinion expressed by the formidable opponent from Faber College is conditioned by more than a century-long shift in aesthetic theory and related developments in the history of ideas. Take a look at this chart, which, if you are not familiar with its type, is a Google Ngram. It's a tool from Google Labs that tracks the appearance of words or phrases through the history of printed books. This one goes from 1675 on the far left to 2000 on the far right. Milton is the blue line, Shakespeare the red, and Donne the green. For the purposes of our argument, suffice it to say that the large trends indicated by Google's data correspond roughly to debates over the value of Milton beginning at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century and lasting into the 1960s. You can see how great Milton's importance was in the 18th century, by the way, right? And just look how that blue line spikes, especially there's an initial spike around 1730, then at mid-century it's huge, and by the time we're getting up to the end of Johnson's era and the American Revolution and the French Revolution, he's off the charts. Well, he's on the chart, but he's very high on the chart. It was not until the time of the American Civil War, and I do find this telling, that Shakespeare comes to predominate in Anglophone literary culture. This progression makes sense to me. In its first century, the compromised ideology of the American Republic slowly set the stage for its tragic play. Milton, more than Shakespeare, inspired Adams and Jefferson. Lincoln was famously haunted by Shakespeare's tragedies. The so-called new criticism defined itself through reappraisal of canonical poets like Milton and Donne. Now, Donne, that squiggly little line at the bottom, it does take a big jump up for Donne after 1925, around 1950. Preferring the living walls of jet, for example, encasing Donne's flea, to the lithe proboscis of Milton's elephant. Milton's detractors, among them Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Middleton Murray, Herbert Reed, and F.R. Leavis, especially F.R. Leavis, were well-known public men of letters whose complaints carried uncommon weight. The essence of their case against Milton was that despite its grand sound, his poetry doesn't mean very much, as Christopher Ricks put it. For the first half of the 20th century, outgunned Milton scholars' reactions to what F.R. Leavis called the dislodgement of their poet in favor of wittier and more visually oriented poets like Donne tended to inarticulate and impotent indignation, more sound, alas, than sense. This is the critical history that precedes my formidable opponent's account of Milton as boring. Yet, even if we were to share the modernist preference for the visual image over the auricular assurance of syllables rolling through lines of measured verse, such a preference would not explain why Milton's verbal thunder should be considered boring, instead of, say, relatively inferior on account of the imprecise visual impressions of a blind man. I reject as sufficient explanation the claim that epic narratives are long, and long has now, in the age of tweets, become a tactful synonym for boring. Classical and medieval rhetoricians did prize plenitude, the power to amplify ideas with a seemingly endless supply of apt and authoritative examples. Yet even by Milton's time, brevity had become increasingly fashionable, especially in the satiric deflation of commonplace wisdom. Think of Polonius and Hamlet. The grand artistic goal and quasi-mystical ambition of Renaissance artists was infinite riches, yes, but infinite riches in a little room, as Marlowe put it. An epic, no matter how long, can only tell the story of everything by epitomizing the world somehow. Our grandest mother in a walled garden, for example, tempted by a serpent, plucking a forbidden fruit and sharing it with her mate. To Samuel Johnson's insistence that nobody ever wished Paradise Lost longer, William Blake slapped back, "Nor the moon rounder." No, length alone is not explanation enough of why we have agreed to condemn Paradise Lost as boring. Given all that Milton manages to include, everything, it's actually quite brief. Tolkien's excellent trilogy is longer and flabbier, and the portentous Harry Potter, as I read his volumes to my children, has seemed to me endless. Readers threaten George Martin because he does not write fast enough, and they can't get enough of the Game of Thrones, which, like Spenser's Fairy Queen, seems capable of going on forever. A partial explanation for why Milton should seem to us boring, one that I have time only to mention here, lies just a bit off from what Leavis criticized: the lack of a correlation between the grandiose sound of Milton's epic and the articulation of its sense. Leavis's assumption is that we do hear Milton's organ music, as he and other poets of the early 20th century did. But for most moderns, Paradise Lost is a poem that is read with the eyes and goes unheard. Over 5 centuries of Prince's near monopoly on the transmission of information, our auditory register for silent reading of the written word, for silent reading of the written word seems to have atrophied. The ordinary experience of Milton's poetry suffers as a consequence. He is the most oral of poets. And if you don't hear him while you read him, you lose much of what is engaging about his verse. Consider this isolated line from Lycidas. I put it up there early so you would read it silently. Without any auditory contribution, read only with the eyes, this line leaves me feeling queasy, perhaps because of oozy and laves. But when it is read out loud, attending especially to the liaison of the last 5 words, his oozy loxy laves, we denizens of print culture recognize, maybe even with a wild surmise, that there is another way in which Milton's poetry works. The effect is distinct from the semantic connotations of oozy and laves afforded by sight reading. The larger cultural reason why readers tend to find Milton boring is perhaps better approached through the one character in Paradise Lost that the formidable opponent from Faber College in another scene says is the only interesting thing about Paradise Lost, the character whose name appears on the blackboard beside the professor's head. Satan has made Milton scholars anxious for centuries, because as William Blake seems to have understood, there was much in Milton that strongly identified with Satan. The chief of the fallen angels memorably expresses the radical Republican energy from which many of Milton's earliest readers had to avert their eyes if they were to appreciate his poetry at all. And the willful occlusion of Milton's political history, like a shadowy planet influencing the motions of a visible one, has affected the reception of Milton ever since. T.S. Eliot admitted as much in the very same essay where several decades after joining with Leavis and the rest to dislodge Milton, he admits that his attack was half-baked and attempts to explain his error. Not coincidentally, I think, this admission occurs in the same lecture in which he brings himself to praise the oral excellence of Milton's verse as, Eliot even includes Samuel Johnson in his confession, though he suggests that Johnson was less conscious of his prejudice simply because he lived only a century after Milton. Can you read that? Is that large enough? There is one prejudice against Milton apparent on almost every page of Johnson's Life of Milton, which I imagine is still general. We, however, with a longer historical perspective, are in a better position than was Johnson to recognize it and to make allowance for it. This is a prejudice which I share myself, an antipathy toward Milton the man. Of this in itself I have nothing further to say. All that is necessary is to record one's awareness of it. But this prejudice is often involved with another more obscure, and I do not think that Johnson had disengaged the two in his own mind. The fact is simply that the Civil War of the 17th century, in which Milton is a symbolic figure, has never been concluded. The Civil War is not ended. I question whether any serious civil war ever does end. Throughout that period, English society was so convulsed and divided that the effects are still felt. Reading Johnson's essay, one is always aware that Johnson was obstinately and passionately of another party. No other English poet, not Wordsworth or Shelley, lived through or took sides in such momentous events as did Milton. Of no other poet is it so difficult to consider the poetry simply as poetry, without our theological and political dispositions, conscious and unconscious, inherited or acquired, making an unlawful entry. Eliot, an American born in the vicinity of Huck Finn's hometown of Hannibal, educated at Harvard, ultimately made his way to England and in 1927 became a subject of the British Crown. During the same year, he converted from Unitarianism to Anglicanism, describing his own faith as specifically Anglo-Catholic. He then enrolled in the Society of King Charles the Martyr. The trajectory of his life seems like an attempt magically to reverse the history of the American Revolution and the British Civil War. He recognizes himself to be symbolically the anti-Milton, and in doing so offers an, I think, becoming apology for the effect of his antipathy, as he names it, for Milton and all that he symbolizes on his, Eliot's, criticism. It's hard not to admire an attempt to account for and correct the effects of bias. But still, if poets were baseball players, I think that Americans would long ago have traded Eliot and some minor poets to be named later for Milton. Eliot may have a no-trade clause, but I doubt he would have vetoed the deal. Eliot's personal history rendered him unusually conscious of 17th century events to which he refers in explaining his youthful attacks on Milton. Things are different today. Most college students know that John Milton is the poet who wrote Paradise Lost. Even the benighted students in Animal House. But how many of them know anything about his politics or his theology? How many of you do? And just what does any of that have to do with Satan? The historical shadow that so makes Samuel Johnson and T.S. Eliot find that boring, unfunny Milton irksome is that he put a pen mightier than any other in Europe at the service of those who rebelled against King Charles I in the 1640s, who defeated King Charles in battle, who dared to imprison their monarch, and who, without any legal precedent for such a proceeding, put on trial and executed Charles Stuart, a man who, according to royalist belief, had been designated by God to rule over them. To justify this shocking behavior, Milton, within days of King Charles's beheading in 1649, published what for brevity's sake is referred to as the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. The full title is, however, revealing. The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, proving that it is lawful and hath been so through all ages for any who have the power to call to account a tyrant or wicked king, and after due conviction to depose and put him to death if the ordinary magistrate have neglected or denied to do it. At the most pivotal moment in British history since 1066, Milton's pamphlet invokes an innovative, if not original, version of the social contract, from which it followed that the people or their representatives enjoy the right to depose their king or change their government. This is from very early on in the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. No man who knows, and this is really characteristic of Milton's rhetoric, because in his century, everyone would have denied what he starts out saying no one would deny. I mean, not everyone, but just about, the predominant opinion. No one who knows aught can be so stupid as to deny that all men naturally were born free, being the image and resemblance of God himself, and were by privilege above all the creatures born to command and not to obey, and that they lived so from the root of Adam's transgression, falling among themselves to do wrong and violence, and foreseeing that such courses must needs tend to the destruction of them all, they agreed by common league to bind each other from mutual injury, and jointly to defend themselves against any that gave disturbance or opposition to such agreement. This is the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. I'm not saying that there's like copying going on here or that Thomas Jefferson was a plagiarist, but this stands behind this, which you generally have heard as what? We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? That God has endowed his creatures with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A century and a quarter later, the same principles were articulated by revolutionaries on the other side of the Atlantic, not least Thomas Jefferson. Shortly thereafter, the framers of the United States Constitution institutionalized the right of the people or their representatives to change the government by mechanisms both ordinary, like elections, and extraordinary, like impeachment, which is often described as the political equivalent of capital punishment. But let us return to the irksome, if not boring, Milton's particular history. After publishing the Tenure, Milton, having been hired as Cromwell's Latin secretary, went on repeatedly to defend the English regicides and attack the dead king as a bloody tyrant. Next to Cromwell, Milton was in the 1650s the most famous man in England. Not at all as a poet, but as the champion of the English people who had exhausted his eyes in the defense of their liberty. Cromwell brought King Charles to trial and execution, but it was John Milton, Englishman, that was the name above the title in his defenses, who justified having done so. Once Cromwell died in 1658, and prior to the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Milton repeatedly begged his countrymen not to subject themselves again to a divine right monarch. He instead recommended that they establish a republic. In so doing, Blair Hawksby has argued, he proposed a division of central and local spheres of representative government, a division necessary if Republican government was ever to function adequately for a political entity larger than a city-state. We call this balance of local and general political spheres federalism. Representative government, federalism. This is all old hat to us, not dangerous thought crime. I doubt I can adequately impress upon you the risk this blind old man took in 1659 and 1660 to champion a radical cause that even he recognized was already lost, and for which he was roundly mocked and derided. No one has been able to figure out exactly how it was that Milton escaped the punishment that others who were not so closely associated with the regicides as he endured. The desire for revenge was extreme, even for those cruel times. Vengeful cavaliers went so far as to dig up the already dead and buried bodies of Cromwell, Bradshaw, and Ireton to execute their insensible corpses for treason. Standard procedure in capital punishment cases called for the convict to be drawn from the Tower on a hurdle or in a cart through the city of London to the place of execution known as Tyburn. Detailing the rest of the sentence will sound indecorous, but you should know what it was that Milton braved. I'm not going to read that out loud. Para-Zagarin observes that in exposing his anti-monarchical opinions so outspokenly at such a moment, Milton stood virtually alone. Many others previously associated with the regicides prudently fled the country. John Dryden, who also worked in Cromwell's Foreign Office and composed verses mourning Cromwell's death in 1658, wrote a far more wholehearted poem anticipating the return of Charles II to London in 1660. The usual practice of poets was to align themselves with wielders of power, as Zagarin notes. Quote, the kings, courts, and nobility whose patronage they solicited. Milton chose the side of rebellion and made himself part of the insurgent forces of his age. On the other side of the Atlantic, however, if we judge by the poetry Anne Bradstreet wrote in the 1640s, for example, opinion of the Civil War and the guilt of the regicides was quite different. In later colonial times and after the Revolution, Milton was embraced as a prophet. Thomas Jefferson's vast library became the heart of the Library of Congress after the War of 1812, when the British set the Capitol building ablaze and the holdings of the original Congressional Library went with it. Jefferson's library, the new core of our National Library, was rich in well-used volumes of Milton, as well as of works that both Milton and Jefferson had studied in forming their Republican convictions. In Jefferson's commonplace book, we find quotations that he copied out from the works that impressed him most, especially in his formative years, when, like the young Milton, he spent his days pursuing a rigorous regime of study from dawn until late into the night. They studied the same authors and even cited the same passages in many instances. There is, however, a major difference. In Jefferson's literary commonplace book, quotations from Milton's poetry and prose appear frequently. And in a volume that Jefferson later composed on the art of English prosody, Milton is the poet most often cited. What has troubled scholars about Jefferson's quotations of Milton is not Milton's influence on Jefferson, but the heavy satanic preponderance of that influence. Jefferson quotes from Paradise Lost 29 times in his literary commonplace books, and roughly a third of those entries are from books 1 and 2, in which Milton recounts the plight of Satan in hell. 7 of the entries copied out by Jefferson are spoken by or directly describe Satan. One critic remarked that Jefferson read Paradise Lost as if it were entitled Satan Agonistes. Jefferson's political enemies in the 1780s and 90s compared him to Satan, referring to his obdurate pride and steadfast hate. We don't have time to go through all the satanic speeches that appealed to Jefferson, or the ones, for that matter, that seem to have appealed to John Adams. So I will first set up Satan's situation as Paradise Lost begins, and then let Satan's first speech serve for all. This may take a little doing. This, I hope, also will give you some sense of what, again, the music of Paradise Lost is like, the other part of the poem, the part you don't hear when you read it silently.
On adamantine chains and penal fire, who durst defy the omnipotent to arms. 9 times the space that measures day and night to mortal men, he with his horrid crew lay vanquished, rolling in the fiery gulf, confounded though immortal, but his doom reserved him to more wrath. For now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. Round he throws his baleful eyes that witness huge affliction and dismay, mixed with obdurate pride and steadfast hate. At once, as far as angels can he views, the dismal situation waste and wild, a dungeon horrible, on all sides round as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell, hope never comes that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, and a fiery deluge fed with ever-burning sulfur unconsumed. Such place eternal justice had prepared for those rebellious.
Okay, that's where Satan is, at the very open of Paradise Lost, having been expelled from heaven. And here's his first speech.
If thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed, from him who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness, didst thou shine myriads so bright. If he who mutual league, united thoughts and counsels, equal hope, and hazard in the glorious enterprise, joined with me once, now misery hath joined with equal ruin. Into what pit thou seest, from what height fallen, so much the stronger proved he with his thunder. Until then, who knew the force of those dire arms? Yet not for those, nor what the potent victor in his rage can else inflict, do I repent or change, though changed in outward luster, that fixed mind and high disdain, from sense of injured merit, that with the mightiest raised me to contend, and to the fierce contention brought along innumerable force of spirits armed that durst dislike his reign, and me preferring. His utmost power with adverse power opposed in dubious battle on the plains of heaven, and shook his throne.
Okay, now these next 4.5 lines are lines that Jefferson quotes in his commonplace book and in a letter he writes late in life, so I want you to pay special attention to them.
What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will, and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield. And what is else not to be overcome? That glory never shall his wrath or might extort from me. To bow and sue for grace with suppliant knee, and deify his power, who from the terror of this arm so late doubted his empire. That were low indeed. That were ignominy.
Pretty good, huh? It sounds good. It's really, I don't know, maybe it isn't to you, but I still find it, after all these years, quite stirring. That's the specific passage that I referred to, lines 105 through 109. He first enters in his commonplace book during his adolescence, when he was younger than you, probably. And he returns to in a letter to G.W. Lewis, dated the 25th of October, 1825, only months before his death, on July 4th of the next year. The Battle of Hastings, indeed, was lost, but the natural rights of the nation were not staked on the event of a single battle. Their wish to recover the Saxon constitution continued unabated, and was at the bottom of all the unsuccessful insurrections which succeeded in subsequent times. The victors and vanquished continued in a state of living hostility. And the nation may say, after losing the Battle of Hastings, "What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield." He's 82 years old. He still has some fire. Jefferson is not the only one in this nation's first decades to draw on the opening books of Paradise Lost and Milton's presentation of Satan. In the first decades of our national history, George Sensabaugh has claimed with strong evidence that Milton played a role he could play nowhere else. He could and did become an inextricable part of a country seeking national identity. But Jefferson seems to me singular in using Satan as a vehicle for approval, specifically approval of maintaining opposition even in the face of crushing defeat. Jefferson read British history as Milton and others on his side in the Civil War read that history. In fighting against what they understood as King Charles's infringement on their rights as free Englishmen, they were renewing a fight that was first lost in 1066, when the Normans conquered England and imposed the yoke of absolute hereditary monarchy. That's why he's talking about the Saxon Constitution. Right? The Anglo-Saxons elected their king. You know in Hamlet, kind of an Anglo-Saxon play, the king is chosen by the people with power in the court, by representatives. He doesn't proceed. Hamlet is not assured, for example, of being the next in line for the throne. It's kind of a group decision. In fighting against in 1066, when the Normans conquered England and imposed the yoke of absolute hereditary monarchy, they were maintaining a resistance that had its first memorable victory with the Magna Carta in 1215. But by and large, as Jefferson observes, the history of the centuries following the Norman conquest until Milton's time and beyond was a history of defeat for those Englishmen, like Milton, whose first premise, political and religious, was individual liberty. To sustain resistance during a long history of defeat requires enormous energy, unrelenting, adversarial energy, such as that expressed more purely and vividly by Satan than by any other character in Milton's epic. Milton composed Paradise Lost during precisely those years when the cause for which he fought, and Jefferson would later fight, was once again suffering defeat. Both Milton and Jefferson recognized, I believe, and am able to argue, that Satan's rebellion was wrong in terms of their own shared political theology. But I also believe that Jefferson found in Satan the repository of such virtue in its primitive Roman republican sense of manly force that staying constant to a good cause in the face of crushing defeat must require. Even Johnson, in his Life of Milton, which, if you remember, Eliot characterizes as being replete with the personal and political antipathy toward Milton that Eliot himself shared, recognizes the powerful independence of Milton in his final paragraph. It is the sort of honesty, even if it is grudging, that makes me an avid reader of Johnson, by the way, even when his prejudice seems to contain it. Of all the borrowers from Homer, Milton is perhaps the least indebted. He was naturally a thinker for himself, confident of his own abilities, and disdainful of help or hindrance. He did not refuse admission to the thoughts or images of his predecessors, but he did not seek them. From his contemporaries, he neither courted nor received support. There is in his writings nothing by which the pride of other authors might be gratified or favor gained. No exchange of praise or solicitation of support. His great works were performed under discountenance and in blindness, but difficulties vanished at his touch. He was born for whatever is arduous. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to hear any questions you might have and talk to you about this.